Robert Sepehr calls himself the most dangerous anthropologist, but what makes him, in my opinion, one of YouTube's most dangerous pseudoscientists? An individual with a rabid following that will no doubt make themselves known in the comment section. His content is just interesting enough to capture an audience, and his ability to mix truths with half-truths and outright lies is impeccable, allowing him to slowly indoctrinate his listeners. He's gained a following of over 500,000. Many of them are great people, and I hope they give this video a listen. They probably don't even realize that he published a book called 1666, Redemption Through Sin. That book highlights an anti-Semitic conspiracy in which he believes Jewish people have hidden the truth about Hitler. They didn't follow his Twitter account prior to his ban, so they didn't see when he tweeted that Jews were trying to subjugate Europe by flooding it with Africans. They don't even realize what they are watching is dangerous. This video is going to be a complete dismantling of Robert, and my goal is for everyone to finish this video with a better understanding of how these people can manipulate others so effectively. And part of that is because it requires a documentary style video to debunk. But we're taking that on, and I'm going to dissect one of his recent videos called Debunking Out of Africa. Now, Robert does have a habit of using copyright claims to censor people, so you'll notice I have his voice sped up and some other small alterations in this video. The term Gish Gallop was first used in 1994 when anthropologist Eugenie Scott grew frustrated with an American young Earth creationist named Duane Gish.
And now with his initial statement from the Institute of Creation Research, Dr. Duane Gish.
At its core, Gish Galloping is using quantity over quality to support your argument. Instead of laying out a clear argument backed up by some main points, the Gish Galloper just lets a constant stream of worthless information spew out of their mouth in a confident manner. Once enough time has passed, the person debating the Gish Galloper has no chance to debunk all of the poor information presented and explain their side. And the Gish Galloper's audience leaves happy, thinking that their side won. Gish Galloping is a dirty but effective debate method in a live debate. It's really hard to go up against. But as Robert's about to find out, it doesn't work as well in video format, because if somebody like me wants to, we can pause it point by point and explain away his lies. I don't want this video to be an attack on Robert. I'm not going to talk about his credentials or his lack of credentials. I'm going to let him do the talking. I want to use his own words and show his audience that he is not the person he portrays himself to be. And for those of you who already know that he's full of it, I want to show you how to kind of pick apart his argument so that when others try to use it, you don't get stuck in the Gish Gallop. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines a straw man as a weak or imaginary argument set up only to be easily confuted. The straw man goes like this. Person B says, "That's silly. I just can't accept the idea that humans evolved from bananas. You can believe that, but I don't." The idea that humans evolved from bananas is the straw man. That isn't something that evolution theory says happens. It's a fake argument that person B made up so that they can attack that argument instead of evolution theory, trying to make their opponent look silly.
And while various hypotheses pertaining to humanity's origins are discussed at the university level, the out of Africa theory is heavily favored, despite compounding evidence to the contrary, because it seems to support a social engineering political agenda rather than a scientific one.
Out of Africa is part of a social engineering political conspiracy. That's a big claim. One that Robert has indicated he will be debunking in this short video, under 15 minutes I believe he said. In his next line, he's going to be offering one of those various hypotheses that he says competes with the out of Africa model for human origins.
Another theory which is touched upon is called the aquatic ape, which I covered in a prior video, that postulates that mankind did not necessarily come about from monkeys and great apes, but may have shared a common ancestor that evolved around water, whether on the surface of the earth by lakes, rivers, and oceans, or in subterranean caverns, which also contain similar bodies of water, with some upright walking hominins later taking to the trees to evolve into branch-climbing monkeys or fur-covered apes.
Robert starts with an interesting take, trying to convince his audience that anthropologists discuss the aquatic ape hypothesis as if it competes with the out-of-Africa model. It doesn't. And even if it were true, it wouldn't compete with the out-of-Africa model. The aquatic ape hypothesis, which was proposed by marine biologist Alistair Hardy in 1960, proposed that humans have some traits that may have evolved in a more aquatic environment. The implication being that sometime between our last common ancestor with chimps and the modern day, a population we descend from lived near water and spent a lot of time in or around that water. Sort of like some modern day populations that have adapted to their more aquatic lifestyle. This hypothesis is not taken all that seriously by paleoanthropologists. It kind of sits up there with the stoned ape hypothesis. It can be kind of fun to talk about around a campfire, but the evidence doesn't necessarily support it. In fact, as we've learned more and more over the decades, we've realized a lot of those initial claims, they could be explained away in ways other than living near water. But now let's listen to what Sepehr says the aquatic ape hypothesis postulates, and let's see if you can identify the straw man on your own.
With some upright walking hominins later taking to the trees to evolve into branch climbing monkeys or fur-covered apes.
If the aquatic ape hypothesis were true, it would not mean that we didn't evolve from apes. I mean, look at the name, aquatic ape. So following that logic, the ancestor that adapted to the water would have had to have existed after the split between chimpanzees and humans. That common ancestor goes back around 7 million years. The aquatic ape would exist less than 7 million years ago. So when Robert claims that the aquatic ape hypothesis actually says hominins evolved first near water, and then some of them went up to the trees and became monkeys and apes, he is showing that he either lacks a fundamental understanding of what evolution theory says, or he is setting up a straw man for his audience. And that appears to be the case, because he's going to keep building on this idea of monkeys and apes evolving from humans in this next segment.
And while this may sound counterintuitive, mainly because of decades of media conditioning, the concept does share some parallels among some of the world's foremost geneticists and evolutionary biologists, who may or may not also have received a coupon at Red Lobster.
Remember, everything Robert just said about some experts believing hominins evolved around water and then later moved to the trees where some evolved into monkeys and apes. He's now going to introduce one paleoanthropologist, and he's picking this one, trying to get his audience to believe that this smart, intelligent expert agrees with what Robert just said.
Dr. Owen Lovejoy is a distinguished evolutionary anthropologist at Kent State University, Ohio, best known for his work on Australopithecine, locomotion, and the origins of bipedalism.
True.
Lovejoy has published more than 100 articles related to his research, and is most well known for his work on reconstructing Lucy, an alleged human ancestor with an opposable big toe on its feet, meaning they resembled thumbs for grasping branches and climbing trees.
Pretty much true, especially the information regarding Dr. Lovejoy. But he's being sneaky here to set up a future lie. When discussing Lucy's feet, he did not show the feet of an Australopithecine. Instead, he showed a picture of the feet of Artie the Ardipithecus. Australopithecine feet are much more human-like than that picture, and you'll see why I mention this later.
While Lovejoy claimed that Lucy, which was dated to 3.4 million years ago, was at least partially bipedal, he proposes that Artie, another alleged human ancestor dated to between 4 and 5 million years ago, spent more of its time allegedly walking than Lucy, despite being over 1 million years older.
This is one reason I had to explain that. There's another one coming up. Robert is now bringing up another hominin, Ardipithecus, the owner of those feet, in an attempt to cast doubt on our understanding of human evolution. It is true that Lovejoy said Ardipithecus appeared to spend more time on 2 feet than Lucy. But that's nothing out of the ordinary. And it certainly has nothing to do with the out-of-Africa model, which takes place way after the Australopithecines. Like, out-of-Africa is referring to humans, not Australopithecines, so who cares?
This article titled, "Man Did Not Evolve from Apes," says, a U.S. biological anthropologist says he's determined humans did not evolve from apes, but rather apes evolved from humans. Kent State University professor C. Owen Lovejoy who specializes in the study of human origins, said his findings came from a study of Ardipithecus ramidus, a hominid species that lived 4.4 million years ago in what is now Ethiopia. Quote, people often think we evolved from apes, but no, apes in many ways evolved from us.
He did say this. Robert Sepehr wants his audience to believe that by saying this, he means humans literally existed before apes and monkeys, and then apes and monkeys evolved from those humans. That is not what Dr. Lovejoy is saying. No one with his level of expertise would actually believe that. Dr. Lovejoy is trying to make a completely different point with this line.
It has been a popular idea to think humans are modified chimpanzees. From studying Ardipithecus ramidus, or Ardi, a partial female skeleton, we learned that we cannot understand or model human evolution from chimps or gorillas.
What Dr. Lovejoy is trying to say here is that the common ancestor of chimpanzees and modern humans was not a human or a chimp. And many people imagine that the common ancestor was probably way more chimp-like. However, chimps, just like us, are highly specialized to their environment. And realistically, they have probably changed quite a bit too since that common ancestor. So we shouldn't just assume that the common ancestors of humans and chimpanzees look like a chimpanzee. Maybe they were a little bit more adapted to upright walking, and then chimpanzees specialized back for the forest. That's what he's saying there. What he is not saying is that humans existed before apes and monkeys, and then some of those humans went up into the trees where they then became apes and monkeys. Like, he's not saying that. But Robert Sepehr is taking him out of context and trying to use him to mislead his audience.
Of course, Lovejoy is still very much in the mainstream, and while he proposes that humans and apes shared a common ancestor that was neither human or monkey, at least he makes it clear that the popular idea that humans are modified chimps is false.
Nothing is really added here. Robert tries to imply to his audience that the evolution theory model states that humans evolved from chimpanzees and are modified chimpanzees, but that's not the case. That's another straw man. Now that's the end of Dr. Lovejoy's time in this video. You tell me. Has bringing this paleoanthropologist up supported any of Robert Sepehr's ideas, or has it all been a part of the Gish Gallop?
My own analysis is that neither Lucy or Artie, which were a little over 3 feet tall, walked upright at all, and were both primarily tree dwellers, not only because their feet resembled hands, like other apes, but because their furry ape-like bodies did not sweat, the way all bipedal hominins do, as sweating is a trait that is associated with running and hunting, which neither of these specimens did.
First off, we have footprint trackways. These exist and you can find plenty of papers on them. But this is one of my favorite parts, because he cites Dr. Lovejoy, a man that has actually worked with these specimens, studying them in person. He's an expert in anatomy, specifically the evolution of bipedal locomotion and the skeletal system of ancient hominids. He is also part of a team that has spent 17 years studying Artie's remains. But then Robert basically says, but everyone else is wrong, and me, the person with no relevant experience or education regarding ancient hominin locomotion, I'm right, because Australopithecines didn't sweat like modern humans. We honestly don't know how much Australopithecines could sweat. They could sweat some. Chimpanzees can sweat some. Realistically, the trend that led to our really efficient sweating was probably already underway by this point. He also mentioned that the reason was because sweating is associated with running and hunting, which neither of these specimens did. But that's him misleading you. And before that specialization of endurance running would have occurred, we would have been adapting to that thermoregulation as the climate was warming. So this again is Robert Sepehr picking and choosing carefully what he's going to reveal to his audience to try to construct this web of lies.
The artistic reconstructions in museums are deceptive, showing erect, upright models with human-like feet, which is a fraud.
Showing upright models isn't fraud, especially when the evidence suggests these animals did walk upright. And despite what Robert says, their feet were pretty similar to humans. Remember, this is where that little seed he planted earlier, that little innocent lie, where he showed the Ardipithecus feet and said they were Lucy's feet. This is when that comes into play. because Australopithecine feet, they were much more human-like than Ardipithecus feet. And if you're keeping track, we still haven't discussed anything that goes against out of Africa.
And while they're not completely fake specimen like the Piltdown Man, which was a baboon's jaw glued onto a human skull and touted as the missing link by the British Museum for almost 50 years.
First off, the Piltdown Man wasn't the only evidence of human evolution we had at that time. We had many Neanderthals and even Homo erectus specimens. Secondly, the Piltdown Man wasn't a baboon jaw. It was an orangutan jaw. Not important, but it does show how little research Robert actually does. And finally, the Piltdown Man was a hoax perpetrated by a con man named Charles Dawson that desperately wanted to be taken seriously by archaeologists of the time. Many scientists were suspicious at the time, but technology was nowhere near where it is today, and it wouldn't be until later that technological advances and advances in science would allow them to disprove this hoax. In the 1940s, chemical tests were developed that would eventually allow scientists to prove that the Piltdown Man was a hoax, a combination of human and orangutan bones that had been manipulated to look like a missing link. In reality, as we found more evidence of ancient hominins, more and more began to doubt the Piltdown Man due to the fact that it appeared so much different than the other evidence they were finding. So really, this is a pretty good story about how and why the scientific method works.
Or the Nebraska Man, which was another imaginary creation based on what turned out to be a pig's tooth.
This one's a lot less interesting. It was a single tooth found on a Nebraska ranch in 1917. 5 years later, the rancher sent the tooth to a Dr. Osborne for identification. Dr. Osborne tried the best he could, and based on the morphology of the tooth, he classified it as an ancient primate, being careful not to imply it was hominid or an ancestor of humans. You'll note that creationist sources and other pseudoscientists like Robert Sepehr are careful not to mention that because they want their listener to believe that the scientists were making up this creature to support the idea of human evolution.
Science is a liar sometimes.
Oh boy.
Even at the time, the find itself was considered inconclusive by most of the scientific community. And when the London News presented an illustrated image of the supposed ancient human ancestor, Dr. Osborne was not impressed and had this to say: "It's a figment of the imagination, of no scientific value, and undoubtedly inaccurate." More fieldwork a few years later uncovered more of that ancient skeleton, and researchers were able to show that the tooth didn't actually belong to a human ancestor, but an extinct genus of peccary that lived in the Americas from 15 to 5 million years ago. With that find, the previous classification was corrected. Scientists aren't perfect. We are human. This is an example of an honest scientist who made a mistake and later retracted that find when new evidence was presented.
The missing link is still very much missing.
The missing link argument hasn't been a thing in over a century. Homo erectus exists, Homo habilis exists, Homo heidelbergensis, the Australopithecines Robert mentioned earlier. All of those would have fit the criteria of a missing link between modern humans and our last common ancestor with the other modern apes, which was the original missing link. So the fact that people still use this term as if it's actually valid evidence against human evolution, it's kind of sad.
And the linear hominin progression proposed by the out of Africa model,
Strawman, evolution isn't linear,
continues to fall apart as advances are made in the field of genetics.
If this were the case, I'd expect to see some evidence presented proving that in this video. We are halfway through it now, and out of Africa has yet to be addressed.
The obsolete and politically motivated out of Africa model proposes a single and relatively recent transition from archaic hominins to anatomically modern humans in Africa.
I want to quickly line out what the out of Africa model actually suggests, because part of Robert's game plan here is to strawman out of Africa as well, and a lot of his audience has a warped view of what the scientists actually say. The out of Africa model says that the last common ancestor of Neanderthals, Sapiens, and Denisovans existed from Africa into Eurasia between 1 million and 500,000 years ago. As the climate shifted, this habitat that was suitable for humans also shifted, especially around northern Africa, causing populations of this ancient species to become fragmented and isolated for hundreds of thousands of years. The isolated populations up north would evolve into the Denisovans out east and the Neanderthals to the west. A population isolated to the south would continue evolving into what we now call sapiens, anatomically modern humans. As the climate continued shifting, the southern range of Neanderthals and northern range of sapiens would occasionally overlap. Evidence of gene flow from sapiens and into Neanderthals over 200,000 years ago proves this. Eventually, around 70,000 years ago, a wave of sapiens left and was successful this time. They grew in number while the Neanderthals and Denisovans decreased and eventually went extinct. And because we know Neanderthals were in Europe and Denisovans were out east, we can also identify when our species was first getting to those regions because we would be interbreeding with them when we got there.
Which is not supported by the fossil record, followed by a later migration to the rest of the world, replacing other still existing hominin populations, which again is not what happened.
Yes, it is. It's supported by both genetics and the fossil record.
DNA sequencing of modern and archaic genomes has now conclusively and irrefutably demonstrated that humanity is a hybrid species and that racial differentiation exists because we're comprised of various degrees of different hominin species which interbred within the past 50,000 years.
This is a very problematic statement, and he's once again hidden a little lie in his claim. First off, DNA sequencing does show that our species interbred with other species as we moved around. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other distant ghost populations. But that doesn't make us a hybrid species in this sense. We are sapiens, the species that originated in Africa, and we interbred with some of the other species. But it does not back up the claim that racial differences are caused by that. In fact, it shows the opposite. One of the main competing models to the out of Africa model was the multi-regional model, an idea that modern human races all evolved from separate species of humans that evolved in different environments before more recently blending back into one, and then that blended group, that was sapiens. While parts of that were true, we did blend with other species. The part that tries to connect that to racial differences isn't true at all. A lot of the things we think about when we think about racial differences, those came to be much more recently because populations are always evolving. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that it's not accurate to believe that the different groups of people today look different because of these other species that interbred with their ancestors. That's not true. And this is important to bring up because Robert's going to try to use this to imply current modern day populations are actually more primitive and less advanced than other populations. And that's where this video, that's where I see real problems with it. Because these are racist implications. These are fueling the white supremacy. Again, I'm not saying that is his motive, but it is true that this content fuels those people and they seek out this content. It makes them feel good. Robert doesn't like when this term gets brought up to describe him. Again, I'm not doing that. I don't know Robert. But the field of human evolution has certainly been warped by white supremacists in the past.
In this article published in Nature, we read that ancient humans lived in a Lord of the Rings world and indulged in interspecies sex, including Neanderthals, Denisovans, and a mystery species, which anthropologists have labeled a ghost species, meaning it's considered super archaic, not yet identified in the fossil record.
This part, 90% true, but a lie hides within. And it's being used to build up a bigger lie that, like I said, is going to cast a certain population of people in a negative light. Everything he said before ghost species is true. But then he lied about what ghost species actually means. The term ghost species means that this is a species that we only know about through DNA. A ghost species does not mean an organism is super archaic, which means super primitive, super ancient. But now listen to what he says.
Which anthropologists have labeled a ghost species, meaning it's considered super archaic, not yet identified in the fossil record, but likely Homo erectus or Homo habilis, over 1 million years removed from modern hominins, and comprises up to 19% of sub-Saharan African DNA, not found in the DNA of Asians or Caucasians.
But likely Homo erectus or Homo habilis.
Robert Sepehr made this up. The published paper that discusses this ghost DNA specifically says the ghost species branched off from our family tree around the same time as the species that led to the Neanderthals and the Denisovans did. So realistically, this hominin species was no more primitive than the Denisovans or the Neanderthals, which he acts like they're more advanced. And remember, the fractioning that led to those different species was caused by the climate, so it makes sense that within Africa, there were populations that became isolated too. Instead of being honest, Robert implies that the species that interbred with these sub-Saharan populations was Homo habilis or Homo erectus. Those are literally the two most primitive members in our genus. Remember, Robert relies on his audience not checking his claims.
This interbreeding event happened about 43,000 years ago in Africa. In other words, it's not possible for sub-Saharan Africans that contain this archaic DNA that is absent in Cro-Magnon to have left Africa 35,000 years ago and magically mutated into what became modern-day Europeans or Caucasians or Asians.
The interbreeding event did occur around 43,000 years ago. Now, Robert is going to offer his first attempt at debunking out of Africa. And it's a mess. He says that because Group A has this admixture from 43,000 years ago, and Group B that left Africa 35,000 years ago does not have it, then Group B cannot descend from Group A. It is very possible for a population to leave Africa that had not interbred with that other population with ghost DNA. But he snuck another big obvious lie in here. It's the magic of the Gish Gallop. I challenge any of you to find a source saying the wave of sapiens that led to modern day Europeans left Africa 35,000 years ago. Not only are there plenty of sapiens fossils outside of Africa predating that, the genetic evidence makes it clear that the dispersal out of Africa happened at least 50,000 years ago. So this was Robert's only attempt at actually debunking out of Africa so far, and it's easily explained away. He lied about the numbers. Sure, 35,000 years ago, you could kind of trick someone into thinking that, yeah, they should have that admixture from 43,000 years ago if we're saying that they came from them. But again, that's a straw man. And the reality of the situation is that 35,000 number, it's inaccurate. 50,000 years is like the very, very conservative take. Realistically, it's longer. Australian populations have been there for longer than 50,000 years. So it's a straw man. It's poorly done. The numbers aren't even correct. And that's his attempt at debunking out of Africa. The next 2.5 minutes are rough. I really don't feel like most of it is worth my time, but I'll play it so I can point out some more of these flaws. Buckle your seatbelts because we're going to somehow get to Atlantis before we address out of Africa again.
So this leaves the question, where did Cro-Magnon, or modern Europeans, come from? When we look up the word indigenous in the dictionary, it says, quote, originating or occurring naturally in a particular place. Native. That said, the islands right off of the coast of Africa are known as the Canary Islands, and the native, indigenous inhabitants were known as Guanches. They left behind tall, blonde, and red-headed mummies and were studied extensively by the National Socialists of the 30s and 40s.
The Guanches are mummies. The oldest one isn't even 2,000 years old. This is recent history, and it doesn't apply to out of Africa at all. But because this last 2.5 minute segment is so full of more Gish Galloping, I have to take it piece by piece.
If we look up the Guanches in the Encyclopedia Britannica, it says that they were the direct descendants of Cro-Magnon, which makes sense, as the museum on the Canary Islands has the largest collection of Cro-Magnon skulls anywhere in the world. It also says that they had blue or gray eyes and blonde hair, which also makes sense, since the mummies that they left behind had blonde and red hair. It also links them to populations in Europe and North Africa, and not only do the Guanches share genetic affinities with the Basque and the Berbers, which are the natives of North Africa, all of these populations are among the highest percentage of Rh-negative blood factor in the world.
Again, This has nothing to do with out of Africa. This is discussing really recent history compared to the out of Africa time frame, which says sapiens originated in Africa around 300,000 years ago, making occasional expansions north that would fizzle out before finally having some population succeed out of Africa around 70,000 years ago.
That said, the Basque mythology, which according to the Center for Basque Studies at the University of Nevada says, quote, "Where did the Basque come from? No one knows exactly where the Basque came from. Some say they have lived in that area since Cro-Magnon man first roamed Europe. Estimates of how long they have lived there vary from 10,000 to 75,000 years. Some say they were descended from the original Iberians."
This paper, published in 2015, entitled Ancient Genomes Link Early Farmers from Atapuerca in Spain to Modern-Day Basques, linked a population of farmers from Spain to the Basque population. These individuals lived between 5,500 and 3,500 years ago, half the minimum age of 10,000 to 75,000 that he just quoted. Or this paper, published in 2021, which also found the Basque population to have been genetically isolated for less than 5,000 years. Again, either way, none of this has to do with out of Africa. It's just a cheap segue to drive the narrative to Atlantis.
More fanciful theories exist as well. One is that the Basques are the descendants of the survivors of Atlantis. The concept of Atlantis becomes less fanciful and more probable when one looks at Pleistocene or Ice Age maps of the Atlantic Ocean, when Atlantis was said to have existed and sea levels were much lower, or genetic maps of the Pleistocene distribution of DNA on both sides of the Atlantic, such as haplogroup X. But we never hear about these perspectives because the people that control the media and academia in the 21st century are the same people that were promoting the Piltdown Man hoax during the 20th century. I have a lot more to say on the subject, but I'm starting to get
hungry,
and also wanted to visit my favorite goose before I cash in my coupon.
Remember when I introduced Gish Galloping? This is the final argument made. Atlantis, based on a population that existed less than 5,000 years ago. This literally has nothing to do with out of Africa. The entire video had one argument, and it was all based on a lie that sapiens first left Africa 35,000 years ago. So all of you people in my comments section on TikTok and here on YouTube, this is your source. When you say I have it all wrong and I'm not listening to the right people, and you recommend that I go watch Robert Sepehr's YouTube videos, this is what I see. I ended up on white supremacy forums, where I saw that in a strange twist, Robert is now being cancelled by some of his more extreme fans he once pandered to. He built his following by publishing anti-Semitic material, only to have his fans discover his family history. I honestly grew to really despise Robert as I learned more about him, but I don't know what to think about this. I also came across this post, and felt like I needed to address it before his fans flood the comments and point out that I'm just a middle school science teacher, not the most dangerous anthropologist. Yes, in this article, researchers describe a ghost species as super archaic. That species branched off from our lineage around 2 million years ago, over 1 million years before the other ghost species in Africa. And the interbreeding with this super archaic hominin actually occurred outside of Africa. Later on, the journalist describes the African ghost species as a super archaic. But I imagine that was just due to her using the same descriptive words as the researcher used discussing the previous group. As I already explained, the African ghost diverged around the same time as the divergence that led to Neanderthals and Denisovans, so the only way you could consider it super archaic is if you also consider those species super archaic. It's a perfect example of what makes Robert so dangerous. He can be extremely convincing to people who don't have a complete, thorough understanding of the topic. Thank you to my patrons. I didn't expect or plan for this video to be so long, but that's the power of the Gish Gallop. It's extremely hard to debunk unless you take the time to unravel every lie and misleading claim. I've decided I want to kind of try to shift this focus to shorter videos, like less than 10 minutes long. My wife doesn't realize this, but I've been up till like 2 a.m. every night this week trying to pump this out. And literally every minute during the day when my daughter is taking a nap, I've been working on this. So I I need to find a way to better manage that time if I'm going to continue doing this as I start a new job in the spring. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on, shorter videos. Maybe the Tong Child, the Altamura Man, Shanidar 1, talking about these individuals and kind of using the maps to tell their story. Speaking of the Patreon, I'm heading to Wyoming next week. I'm going to be getting some cool footage while I'm out there, and I'm going to be working alongside one of my buddies I met last year, and we're going to be doing some prospecting, so some exploring right there around the KPG boundary and also the PETM, which is another boundary I'm hoping to teach about, and it's got a really interesting parallel to our modern global warming. So that's only possible because of you guys. I'm a school teacher. I don't have a ton of money for this fuel, for the sleeping bag, the tent, the gimbal, all of that stuff. As a new dad, I wouldn't be purchasing that without you guys supporting me. So thank you, and hopefully the next video comes out soon.